Lieutenant Commander Daniel Cole stood at the observation window of the Earth Alliance vessel Horizon and watched the stars drift slowly past. He had served in the diplomatic corps for 12 years. He had negotiated trade agreements with the eye merchants. He had helped establish peace between the clans. He had seen things that most humans would never believe, but nothing in his career had prepared him for the message that arrived that morning. The orders came directly from High Command on Earth. They were marked with the highest priority seal. Daniel read them 3 times to make sure he understood correctly. The Empire was offering humanity a seat at the Galactic Assembly. This was the governing body that controlled trade routes, settled disputes between species, and determined which civilizations were worthy of respect in the greater galaxy. Humanity had been trying to earn a seat for 50 years. Now they were offering it freely. But there was a price. The followed ancient traditions that dated back thousands of years before humans had learned to make fire. One of these traditions was the marriage alliance. When 2 civilizations wished to bind themselves together, they sealed the agreement with a union between their noble houses. They had 4 princesses. The youngest was named Eve, and High Command had decided that Daniel Cole would marry her. Daniel sat down heavily in his chair and stared at the orders. He had never met them in person. He had seen images of them. They were tall, nearly 7 feet on average, with blue skin that shifted in shade depending on their emotions. They had 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on their faces. Their culture was built on rigid hierarchy and ancient ceremony. They viewed humans as newcomers to the galactic stage, barely worth noticing. And now he was supposed to marry one of their princesses. His commanding officer, Admiral Lane, contacted him within the hour. Her face appeared on his screen looking tired and sympathetic. She told him that she had argued against this assignment. She had told High Command that Daniel deserved a choice, but they had specifically requested a human of his rank and experience. The Emperor himself had reviewed the candidates and selected Daniel from a list of hundreds. Daniel asked her why him. Admiral Lane was quiet for a moment. Then she told him the truth. They did not actually want this alliance. They were being pressured by the other great powers to accept humanity into the assembly. By offering their youngest and least valued daughter, they were sending a message. They were saying that humans were worthy of only the scraps from their table. Daniel understood. He was not being honored. He was being insulted, and he had to accept the insult with a smile for the sake of his entire species. The journey to the took 3 weeks. Daniel spent the time studying everything he could find about their culture, their history, their language. He learned that society was divided into strict castes. The royal family sat at the top, followed by the military houses, the merchant clans, and finally the common workers. Movement between castes was almost impossible. A person was born into their place and died in it. He learned about their religion, which centered on the movements of their 3 moons. Children born under certain moon alignments were considered blessed. Others were considered cursed. The records he found mentioned that Princess Eve had been born under the dark moon, when all 3 moons were hidden. This was the worst possible omen in belief. She had been marked as unfortunate from her first breath. Daniel felt something shift in his chest when he read this. He had been raised on Earth, where people believed that a person made their own destiny. The idea that a child could be condemned simply because of when she was born seemed cruel beyond measure. The Horizon arrived at Ra on a morning when the planet's twin suns painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. Daniel looked down at the surface and saw cities that sparkled like fields of diamonds. They built their structures from a crystal that grew naturally in their mountains. These towers caught the sunlight and scattered it in rainbow patterns across the land. It was beautiful. It was alien. It was terrifying. A shuttle carried Daniel down to the capital city. He was met at the landing platform by a delegation of officials who looked at him the way a person might look at a stain on their clothing. They spoke to each other in their own language, not bothering to include him in the conversation. Daniel understood a few words from his studies. They were discussing whether he was taller or shorter than they had expected. The conclusion seemed to be that he was disappointing either way. The emperor's palace rose from the center of the city like a mountain made of light. Daniel was led through corridors that stretched for what seemed like miles. Servants stopped and stared at him as he passed. He heard whispers following him like shadows. The word that repeated most often was one he recognized: primitive. The throne room was vast enough to hold 1,000 people. Today it held only the emperor and his court. Emperor or sat on a throne carved from a single piece of black crystal. He was ancient by standards. His blue skin faded to a pale gray. His 4 eyes watched Daniel approach with an expression that revealed nothing. Daniel bowed as he had been instructed. He spoke the formal greeting in the language, though he knew his accent was terrible. The court murmured at his attempt. Some seemed amused. Others seemed offended that he had dared to speak their tongue at all. The emperor acknowledged his greeting with the barest nod. Then he introduced his daughters. The 3 eldest princesses stood beside the throne like statues carved from ice. They were beautiful in the way that dangerous things are often beautiful. They looked at Daniel and through him and past him as if he did not exist. The youngest princess was not present. The emperor explained that Daniel would meet her tomorrow at the formal betrothal ceremony. His tone suggested that this delay was a mercy, though Daniel was not sure for whom. That night, Daniel lay awake in the quarters they had given him. The room was larger than his entire apartment on Earth. The bed was sized for someone twice his height. Everything around him was designed to remind him that he did not belong here. He thought about the princess he had not yet met. He thought about the whispers that called her cursed. He thought about how it felt to be judged for something you could not control. Tomorrow he would meet her. Tomorrow everything would change. He just did not know how much. The morning of the betrothal ceremony arrived with cold light streaming through the crystal walls of Daniel's chambers. He had barely slept. His mind had been too full of questions and worries, and the strange feeling that he was standing at the edge of something he could not see. Servants came to dress him in formal robes that they had provided. The fabric was heavy and stiff, and colored in shades of deep purple that signified his status as a guest of the imperial house. The servants worked in silence. They did not look at his face. Daniel wondered if they had been ordered to treat him this way, or if they simply found him too alien to acknowledge. The throne room was even more crowded than the day before. Nobles from every corner of the empire had gathered to witness this historic moment. Daniel could feel their eyes on him as he walked down the central aisle toward the throne. The weight of their attention pressed against him like a physical force. He kept his back straight and his expression calm. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him falter. Emperor or sat upon his throne with the same unreadable expression he had worn yesterday. The 3 elder princesses stood in their places, beautiful and cold. The court fell silent as Daniel reached the foot of the throne and bowed. Then the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and Princess Eth entered. She was smaller than her sisters, as Daniel had expected from the records. Where they were tall and imposing, she seemed almost delicate. Her skin was a lighter shade of blue, like the sky of Earth at twilight. She walked with her head slightly bowed and her 4 eyes fixed on the floor in front of her feet. She moved like someone trying to pass through the world without being noticed. The nobles watched her with expressions that ranged from pity to contempt. Daniel heard the whispers start again. Dark moon child, cursed one, unfortunate daughter. The words followed her like a cruel shadow as she made her way to stand beside him. The ceremony itself was brief and formal. A priest in elaborate robes spoke words in ancient that Daniel did not fully understand. The emperor gave a short speech about the importance of alliances and the necessity of adapting to changing times. He did not look at his daughter as he spoke. He did not look at Daniel either. His words were aimed at the nobles, reassuring them that this arrangement was a political tool and nothing more. When the formal portion ended, tradition required the newly betrothed couple to share a private meal. This was meant to give them time to become acquainted before the wedding. A servant led Daniel and Eth through a series of corridors to a small garden chamber that overlooked the crystal city below. The room was beautiful. Flowering plants from across the worlds filled the space with sweet scents. A table had been set with dishes that Daniel did not recognize. Through the transparent walls, he could see the twin suns beginning their descent toward the horizon. The servant left them alone and closed the door. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel studied the princess from the corner of his eye. She stood near the window with her hands clasped in front of her. She had not looked at him once since entering the throne room. He wondered if she was afraid of him or simply uninterested. Then she spoke, and her voice surprised him. It was soft but clear, and she spoke in perfect English with only a trace of accent. "You do not want this either," she said. It was not a question. Daniel turned to face her fully. She was looking at him now, and he saw something in her four eyes that he had not expected. There was fear there, yes, but beneath the fear was a sharp intelligence that she had been hiding. This was not the broken creature that the court whispered about. This was someone who had learned to survive by being overlooked. "No," Daniel admitted. "I was ordered to come here. I had no choice in this." Eth nodded slowly. "I know. Your government sent records of the candidates they were considering. I read them all." Daniel blinked in surprise. "You read them?" "I read everything I can find about humans," she said. She moved to the table and sat down, gesturing for him to join her. "I have been listening to your radio broadcasts for years. Your music, your news programs, your stories. I learned your languages from recordings. English, Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic. I wanted to understand your people." Daniel sat across from her, his mind racing. "Why?" Eth was quiet for a moment. She looked out at the city below, at the crystal towers catching the fading light. "Because I knew this day would come," she said finally. "I knew that eventually the great powers would force my father to accept humans into the assembly, and I knew that when that happened, they would use me as the sacrifice, the cursed daughter, given to the primitive species, a way to fulfill the obligation while showing contempt for both parties." Her voice was calm, but Daniel heard the pain beneath the words. He understood now why she had studied humans so carefully. She had been preparing for a future she could not escape. "So I decided to learn everything I could," Eth continued. "And do you know what I discovered?" Daniel shook his head. She turned to face him, and for the first time he saw something like hope in her eyes. "I discovered that humans are not primitive at all. Your species reached the stars in mere centuries while my people took. You survived wars that would have destroyed other civilizations. You adapt, you change, you grow. You do not accept the fate you are given. You make your own." She leaned forward slightly. "I have watched my empire grow old and rigid. Our birth rates decline every generation. Our culture forbids change. We are dying slowly and no one will admit it." Daniel felt the weight of her words settling over him. This was not a casual observation. This was a warning. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Eth held his gaze. "Because I did not just study your people," she said. "I requested this marriage myself." The words hung in the air between them. Daniel stared at her, trying to understand. "My father thinks this was his idea," she continued. "He does not know that I have been preparing for years. I chose you, Daniel Cole, from all the candidates. I chose you because your record shows that you listen before you speak. You think before you act. You see value in those that others dismiss." She reached across the table and touched his hand. Her skin was cool and smooth. "I need you to trust me," she said. "There are things happening in this empire that you do not know, dangerous things, and I cannot stop them alone." Daniel looked at this princess who had been called cursed since birth. He looked at her intelligence, her courage, her desperate hope. "Tell me," he said, "tell me everything." Eth spoke for nearly an hour while the twin suns sank below the horizon, and the 3 moons rose to take their place. Daniel listened without interruption as she revealed secrets that would have cost her life if the wrong person overheard. The empire was dying. This was not speculation or fear. It was simple mathematics. Their birth rates had been declining for 600 years. Each generation was smaller than the one before. The great cities that had once housed millions now echoed with empty spaces. The crystal towers were beautiful, but many of them stood abandoned, maintained only by automated systems that no longer had anyone to serve. The cause was their own culture. Society was built on tradition and hierarchy. Change was forbidden. Innovation was suspicious. The same families had held power for thousands of years, and they refused to adapt to new circumstances. When their scientists warned about the declining population, the nobles dismissed the warnings as pessimism. When their doctors suggested changes to medical practices, the priests called it heresy. And so the empire continued to shrink, while its leaders pretended everything was fine. But that was not the worst of it. Eth lowered her voice even further, though they were alone. "There is a faction within our military," she said. "They call themselves the Purifiers. They believe that our decline is not natural. They believe it is caused by contamination from other species, from contact with aliens who are beneath us." Daniel felt a chill run through him. "They blame outsiders for your problems." "Yes, and they have a solution." Ed's eyes were dark with worry. "They want to conquer. They want to expand the empire by force, taking resources and territory from weaker civilizations. They believe that war will restore our strength and our pride." "And humanity is a target," Daniel said. It was not a question. "Humanity is the first target," Eth confirmed. "Your species is young, and your military is small compared to ours. The Purifiers see you as easy prey. But more than that, they see this alliance as a humiliation. The idea that would lower themselves to marry humans fills them with rage." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit city. "Their leader is General Os. He commands nearly a third of our fleet. He has been whispering in my father's ear for years, pushing him toward war. My father resists because he knows the other great powers would intervene. An attack on humanity would unite the galaxy against us." "So they need an excuse," Daniel said, understanding now. "They need humanity to strike first." Eth turned back to face him. "They need humanity to appear to strike first, and they have a plan to make that happen." She told him about the assassination plot. During the wedding ceremony, hidden assassins would kill Daniel. The attack would be designed to look like it came from human agents who had infiltrated the palace. The Purifiers had already prepared evidence that would point to Earth's intelligence services. Within hours, General Os would have the justification he needed to launch his war. Daniel's mind raced through the implications. Even if Earth could prove its innocence, the damage would be done. The alliance would be destroyed. The fleet would be on its way before anyone could stop them. "How do you know all this?" he asked. Eth smiled, but there was no joy in it. "Because no one pays attention to the cursed princess. I am invisible to them. I walk through the palace and they do not see me. I hear conversations that they would never speak in front of anyone important. I found documents that they thought were safely hidden." She reached into the folds of her robe and pulled out a small crystal device. "I have been gathering evidence for months. Recordings, messages, plans. Everything the general and his followers have discussed." Daniel stared at the crystal in her hand. "Why haven't you given this to your father?" "Because I do not know who I can trust." Her voice cracked slightly for the first time. "The Purifiers have supporters throughout the court, even among my father's advisors. If I give this evidence to the wrong person, they will destroy it and destroy me. I needed someone outside their reach, someone they would never suspect." "You needed a human," Daniel said. "I needed you," she corrected. "I read your file, Daniel. I know what you have accomplished. You stopped a war between the clans when everyone said it was impossible. You found solutions that no one else could see. You do not think the way think, and that is exactly what we need." Daniel sat back in his chair and tried to process everything he had learned. A few hours ago, he had been a reluctant participant in a political arrangement he had not chosen. Now, he was the only thing standing between his species and annihilation. He could try to escape. He could find a way back to his ship and warn Earth. But that would confirm the Purifier's narrative. A human diplomat fleeing in the night would look like guilt. It would give them exactly what they wanted. Or he could stay. He could work with this princess who had been dismissed by her own people. He could use the evidence she had gathered to expose the conspiracy before it was too late. It was an impossible choice. He was one man in a hostile empire surrounded by enemies he could not identify. The odds of success were almost zero. But then he looked at Eth. He looked at this woman who had been called cursed since the day she was born, who had been ignored and dismissed and treated as worthless, and yet she had spent years preparing for this moment. She had learned human languages and studied human culture. She had gathered evidence at risk to her own life. She had done all of this because she believed in something. She believed that things could change. She believed that humans and could work together. She believed that her empire could be saved from itself. Daniel had spent his whole career believing that understanding and communication could solve problems that war could not. He had built his life on the idea that different species could find common ground if they were willing to try. How could he abandon that belief now, when it mattered most? "The wedding is in 3 days," he said slowly. "That is not much time." Eth nodded. "It is not. We will need to identify all the conspirators. We will need to find allies we can trust. We will need to expose General Oss in a way that he cannot deny or escape from." "Yes," she said. Daniel stood and walked to stand beside her at the window. The moons cast silver light across his face. "On Earth," he said, "we have a saying, 'The enemy of my enemy is my friend.'" Eth tilted her head slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means that we are not as alone as we think." He turned to face her. "You and I both want to stop this war. We both want this alliance to succeed. We both have been underestimated by everyone around us." He held out his hand to her in the human gesture of partnership. "I think we should show them how wrong they were." Eth looked at his hand for a long moment. Then she reached out and took it. Her grip was firm and steady. "Together," she said. "Together," Daniel agreed. Outside the window, the 3 moons continued their slow dance across the sky. Somewhere in the palace, General Oss was finalizing his plans for murder and war. He believed that nothing could stop him. He believed that the cursed princess was harmless and the human diplomat was helpless. He was about to learn how dangerous it was to underestimate the people you thought were beneath you. The next 2 days were the most intense of Daniel's life. He and Eth worked in secret, meeting in the garden chamber where they had first spoken honestly. They could not risk being seen together too often, so they developed a system of communication that only they would understand. Eth had told him about her love of human music. She had spent years listening to broadcasts from Earth, and her favorite was jazz. The improvised melodies and unexpected rhythms fascinated her. They were so different from the rigid, formal music of tradition. Daniel used this knowledge to create a code. When they passed each other in the palace corridors, they would hum fragments of jazz standards. A few notes from one song meant that they needed to meet. A few notes from another meant danger. The who heard them thought it was just the human making strange noises. They did not realize that an entire conversation was happening right in front of them. Daniel studied the evidence that Eth had gathered. The recordings were damning. General Oss spoke openly about his plans when he believed he was among trusted allies. He called humans a disease that needed to be cut out. He described how the assassination would happen. He laughed about how easy it would be to fool the galaxy into believing that Earth had struck first. But evidence alone was not enough. They needed witnesses. They needed who would stand up and confirm what the recordings showed. Without that, General Oz could claim the recordings were faked by human spies. Eth knew the court better than anyone. She knew which nobles secretly disagreed with the purifiers. She knew which military officers had been passed over for promotion because they refused to join the conspiracy. She knew which servants had overheard things they were not supposed to hear. One by one, she approached them. She was careful and patient. She let them think they were confiding in the harmless princess rather than being recruited. By the end of the second day, they had assembled a small network of allies who were ready to speak the truth when the moment came. Daniel contributed something that they did not expect: human creativity. The purifiers had planned their conspiracy with precision. Every step was logical and orderly. They had considered every threat that it might pose, but they had not considered how a human might think. Daniel suggested approaches that seemed almost random to Eth at first. He proposed creating distractions in unexpected places. He suggested spreading false information to make the conspirators uncertain of what they knew. He recommended approaching potential allies from angles that No would consider. "You do not think in straight lines," Eth observed after he explained one particularly unusual plan. "No," Daniel agreed. "We think in curves and spirals and sometimes complete circles. It drives other species crazy." "I am beginning to understand why," she said, but she was smiling. The plan they developed was complex but elegant. On the day of the wedding, they would allow the ceremony to proceed normally until the moment when the assassins prepared to strike. Then Daniel would do something that no human had ever done in the history of relations. He would address the assembly directly in their own language. Eth had been teaching him in their secret meetings. Daniel learned quickly. Languages had always been his strength. Within 2 days he was not fluent, but he could speak clearly enough to be understood. More importantly, he could speak well enough to shock the entire court into silence. While the nobles were stunned by this impossibility, Eth's allies would move into position. The loyal officers would secure the exits. The witnesses would come forward, and the evidence would be presented in a way that General Oz could not escape. It was a dangerous plan. 100 things could go wrong, but it was the best chance they had. During those 2 days, something else happened that neither of them had expected. They began to care for each other. It started with small things. Daniel told Eth about Earth. He described the oceans that covered most of his world, so different from the endless purple seas of Ra. He talked about forests where trees grew taller than any crystal tower. He shared stories of human history, of the wars they had survived, and the peace they had built afterward. Eth listened with fascination. She asked questions that showed how deeply she had studied his people, but hearing it from someone who had lived it was different than reading records or listening to broadcasts. She began to see humans not as a species to be analyzed, but as people to be understood. In return, she taught him about her world. She recited poetry that had never been translated into any human language. She explained the deeper meanings behind their rituals and traditions. She showed him that beneath the cold exterior of her culture, there was beauty and passion and sorrow. "We were not always like this," she told him one evening. "There was a time when dreamed of the stars the same way humans do now, when we were young and curious and brave." "What changed?" Daniel asked. "We became powerful, we built an empire, and then we became afraid of losing what we had built." She looked down at her hands. "Fear makes people rigid. It makes them cling to the old ways because change might bring loss." Daniel thought about that for a long time. "Humans have the opposite problem," he said finally. "We change so quickly that sometimes we lose track of who we are. We throw away traditions that took generations to build." Eth smiled slightly. "Perhaps that is why we need each other. You remind us to grow, we remind you to remember." On the night before the wedding, they sat together in the garden chamber one last time. The 3 moons hung full and bright in the sky. Tomorrow would bring either salvation or disaster. There was no way to know which until it happened. "Are you frightened?" Eth asked. "Terrified," Daniel admitted. "Good, so am I." She reached out and took his hand. "On Earth you have another saying. You told me about it. Hope is the thing with feathers." Daniel nodded. "It is from a poem, about how hope keeps singing even in the darkest storms." "I did not understand it when you first told me," she said, "but I think I understand it now." She squeezed his hand gently. "You are my hope, Daniel Cole. You are the thing with feathers that I have been waiting for." Daniel felt something warm spread through his chest. This woman who had been dismissed by her own people, who had been called cursed and worthless, had spent years preparing for a chance to change her world. She had chosen him to help her. She had trusted him with her life and the lives of millions. He would not let her down. "We are going to succeed," he said. He was not sure if it was a promise or a prayer. "We are going to try," she replied, "and sometimes that is all anyone can do." They sat together in silence as the moons traveled across the sky. Tomorrow would come soon enough. For now, they held onto this moment of peace. 2 people from different worlds, brought together by circumstance, choosing to face the darkness together. It was not much, but it was everything. The wedding day dawned under a sky painted in shades of gold and crimson. Daniel stood in his chambers and looked at himself in the mirror. He wore the ceremonial robes that had been prepared for him. They were white and silver, the colors of a groom. He looked strange in them. He felt stranger. In a few hours, everything would change. Either the conspiracy would be exposed and the alliance would survive, or he would be dead and humanity would face war. There was no third option. A servant came to escort him to the great hall. Daniel walked through the crystal corridors for what might be the last time. He passed nobles who watched him with cold eyes. He passed servants who looked away. He passed guards who stood at attention, and he wondered how many of them were loyal to the emperor and how many belonged to General As. The great hall was filled with more people than Daniel had ever seen in one place. Nobles from across the empire had come to witness this historic occasion. Diplomats from a dozen other species stood in the observation galleries. The entire galaxy was watching. Emperor Or sat upon his throne, ancient and unreadable. The 3 elder princesses stood beside him in their formal robes. General As stood nearby, his military uniform decorated with medals and honors. He looked at Daniel with an expression of barely concealed contempt. Daniel took his place at the altar and waited. The doors at the far end of the hall opened, and Eth entered. She was beautiful. Daniel had noticed this before, but now it struck him with full force. She wore a gown of pale blue that matched her skin, and her 4 eyes shone with a light that he had never seen before. She was not bowing her head today. She walked with her spine straight and her chin lifted. The court noticed the change. Whispers rippled through the assembly. This was not the cursed princess they knew. This was someone else entirely. Eth reached the altar and stood beside Daniel. She glanced at him briefly, and he saw the fear hidden behind her confidence. He gave her the smallest nod. They were ready. The priest began the ceremony. He spoke words in ancient that dated back thousands of years. Daniel understood some of them now, thanks to Eth's teaching. They spoke of duty and alliance and the binding of 2 peoples. As the ceremony continued, Daniel watched General As from the corner of his eye. The general was speaking quietly with one of his officers. Small movements were happening throughout the hall, guards shifting positions, hands moving toward hidden weapons. The assassins were preparing. The priest reached the moment when the couple would speak their vows. This was the part of the ceremony that would be interrupted by violence. This was when Daniel was supposed to die. Instead, he stepped forward and began to speak in. The hall went silent. Complete, absolute silence. No human had ever spoken their language in a formal setting. No human was supposed to be capable of learning it so quickly. Every eye in the room fixed on Daniel as he addressed the assembly. "Honored nobles of the empire," he said. His accent was imperfect, but his words were clear. "I come before you today not just as a diplomat from Earth, but as someone who has learned a terrible truth. There are those among you who do not want this alliance to succeed. They have planned to murder me on this very day and blame my own people for the crime." General Oss surged to his feet. "This is outrageous, the human lies." But Daniel continued speaking, his voice carrying across the vast hall. "I have evidence, recordings of conversations where the conspiracy was discussed in detail, documents that outline the entire plan, and witnesses who are ready to confirm what I say." He gestured, and Eth's allies moved into action. Loyal officers secured the doors. Servants who had overheard incriminating conversations stepped forward. A military commander who had refused to join the purifiers walked to the center of the hall and stood beside Daniel. "I am Commander Haz of the Imperial Guard," he announced. "I have seen the evidence the human speaks of. It is genuine. General Oss has committed treason against the throne." Chaos erupted. Nobles shouted and pointed. Guards drew weapons, unsure who to aim them at. General Oss tried to signal his assassins, but they found themselves surrounded by loyal soldiers. Emperor Or raised his hand, and slowly the hall fell quiet. "General," the Emperor said. His voice was soft but carried an edge of cold fury. "You will explain yourself." Oss attempted to deny everything. He called Daniel a liar and a spy. He claimed the evidence was fabricated. But then Eth stepped forward. "Father," she said, "I gathered this evidence myself over many months. I was invisible to the conspirators because they thought I was worthless. They spoke freely in my presence because they believed I was too cursed to matter." She played the recordings. The general's own voice filled the hall, speaking of murder and war and the conquest of Earth. The assembly listened in growing horror as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. When the recordings ended, Emperor Or rose from his throne. He looked older than he had at the start of the ceremony. His 4 eyes were filled with a sorrow that seemed to age him even further. "Take the general into custody," he commanded. "He will face trial for treason." Oss was led away, shouting protests that no one listened to. His co-conspirators were identified and arrested one by one. The assassination plot collapsed before it could begin. In the silence that followed, the Emperor turned to face Daniel and Eth. For a long moment, he simply looked at them. Then he spoke. "You learned our language," he said to Daniel. "You saw through a conspiracy that had fooled my own advisors, and you trusted my daughter when her own family did not." He looked at Eth, and something in his expression shifted. It was not quite warmth, but it was no longer cold. "And you," he said to her, "you saw danger that I was blind to. You prepared for years while I ignored you. You saved this empire from a war it could not win." He was silent for a moment. Then he did something that no one in the hall expected. He bowed to them. "Perhaps," Emperor Or said slowly, "we have been wrong about many things." The wedding ceremony was completed. The alliance was sealed. Daniel and Eth stood together as husband and wife in the eyes of 2 civilizations. In the days that followed, the story spread across the galaxy. Other species heard about the human who had learned in 3 days. They heard about the princess who had been called cursed and turned out to be the bravest person in the empire. They heard about how 2 people who had been underestimated by everyone had saved millions of lives. And they began to look at humanity differently. Not as primitive newcomers, not as a young species barely worth noticing, but as something else entirely. Daniel stood with Eth on a balcony overlooking the Crystal City. The twin suns were setting, painting the sky in colors that had no names in any human language. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we build something new," she replied. "Something neither of our peoples could build alone." She turned to face him, and her 4 eyes reflected the light of the setting suns. "You asked me once why I chose you," she said. "I told you it was because you listen and think and see value in those that others dismiss. But that was not the whole truth." "What was the whole truth?" She smiled. "I chose you because when I read your file, I saw someone who believed that the universe could be better than it is. Someone who never stopped hopping even when hope seemed foolish." She took his hand. "I needed that. My people needed that." Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "On Earth," he said, "we have a saying. Behind every great civilization is someone who refused to accept things the way they were." "I like that saying," Eth said. "I thought you might." They stood together as the suns disappeared below the horizon, and the 3 moons began their slow rise. Somewhere out there, the galaxy was watching. Other species were wondering what would come next. Humanity had earned its seat at the table, not through war or conquest, but through something far more dangerous. They had learned, they had adapted, they had connected. And they were only getting started.